Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Gathering Room series. It is really great to be here. I'm Anna Lappé, and I'm an author and activist for food systems transformation. But what matters to all of you today is I am a very proud board member of the Mesa Refuge, host of the Gathering Room. We are here today to have what I hope will be a really fun conversation. I know it will, with Lara Bazelon, who I'll introduce in a moment. But first, just a couple words about Mesa. For those who are new to the Mesa Refuge, the Mesa Refuge is a retreat center in the San Francisco Bay Area in Point Reyes Station, if you're familiar, just north of San Francisco. And it's a retreat center for writers and activists that are dedicated to trying to make the world a better place. Over our 23-year history, we've hosted over 900 people who have spent 2 weeks at the Mesa working on books, podcasts, other projects. And we are really proud that Lara Bazelon, who you are here to hear from, is one of our alums. During the pandemic, we developed this monthly series, this online series called From the Gathering Room. So I want to just start by introducing Lara and then bring us into conversation together. And again, super excited to be here, and thanks you all for joining us. So Lara is a law professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law. Before that, she worked as a deputy federal public defender and the director of a Los Angeles-based Innocence Project. She's a former Mesa Refuge resident, alum, as I said, and her website is larabazelon.com. You can find her on Facebook, on Twitter at Lara Bazelon, on Instagram, and I highly recommend following her on Twitter. She has always great insights there. And today we are here to talk about her new debut novel. So as you can hear from her bio, Lara is a lawyer, works in the field of law, but also she just wrote a novel. She's also the author of a nonfiction book, which we'll be talking about today as well. And what I'm hoping to do together with you, Lara, is have a conversation about some of the themes of this book. So some of the themes around motherhood, around legal profession, around balancing being a mother and being a working lawyer, some of the themes of innocence and justice and criminal justice reform movements that we are witnessing unfold all around us. So lots of themes to touch on. But first, welcome, Lara. Thank you for being here.
Anna, it is such a delight to be with you in conversation. I wish we could be together in the actual gathering room, but this is by far the next best thing. Thank you for doing this.
Sure. And I will confess, Lara and I have some mutual personal friends. So we actually have had a cocktail together. And yes, it would be much better if we were having one together, but virtual is as good as it gets these days. So glad we are here. So, because it is Mesa that is bringing us together, I just thought I would start, Lara, if you just want to say a few words about what that Mesa writing experience was for you. Did you work on this novel there? And if you want to just share any words about being at Mesa and how that informed your process.
I do want to talk about Mesa, and actually anyone who's listening who is an aspiring writer or a professional writer and has a project, I encourage you to apply, because being at Mesa is everything that Anna said. And it's really just this incredibly beautiful place. It's this house. You have a view of Tomales Bay. There are 2 writing sheds, and there's usually 3 people there at a time, and you're there for 2 weeks and you're working on your writing, but you're also just enjoying the space. And I got a lot of time to just go running and take hikes, and it was very peaceful. I did work on my nonfiction book there. I feel like I'm confessing to something that means I'll never get to come back, but I also did work on this book while I was there. I didn't tell them I was doing that. So now I feel like maybe I've blackballed myself, but in fact, I did work. I did work on it. I did work on it while I was there.
So much of the focus of Mesa is supporting nonfiction authors, people working on serious tomes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And because they didn't give me the residency to do it.
Well, your secret is safe with us. But I think one of the things that I want to get at, Lara, is actually how this novel you wrote, I mean, it really does, it's a page turner, and it was such a nice refuge, speaking of refuges, from my usual reading, which is all nonfiction. But I also feel like in the process of reading it, it got me thinking about these big themes that we're going to talk about today. And I want to just start by talking about one of those big themes, which is that, so this novel is a story about a working mother. It's a story about a lawyer who cuts her maternity leave short to take a case that she's really passionate about. And, I wonder, let's start there. I wonder if you want to share anything about the parallels between the main character and you. I know they say about novelists, like you should, write what you know, but curious if you want to share anything about how close to you this character was and why you chose to make this character, the main character of the book, a working mother who made the choices she did.
I thought it was really important to highlight what I think so many moms face, which is this strange thing where you have a child and the expectation, I think, is one that you're going to have this magical transformation and you're going to become a different person, which for some people is true, but for a lot of people is not. And that also you're going to either find a way to sort of step back from your job or, I guess, purport to have everything in this perfect equipoise, which the equipoise part is not really possible. And so my theory or my belief about women and careers in my nonfiction life, in my actual life, is that sometimes you do actually have to put your job first. And that's a very controversial thing for a woman, for a mom to say. It is not actually a particularly controversial thing for a dad to say. And so I thought it would be interesting to have a fictional character do that in a very extreme way, where she has a newborn and she has all this paid leave and she radically cuts back on it, which I never did. But I did have a situation with my second child where my job said you only get 12 weeks of unpaid leave. And if you don't come back, we're going to fire you. And so I think that's a pretty standard thing that a lot of women also have to deal with, these very short leaves.
Right. Or no paid leave at all. I mean, when I was reading your novel, I was remembering that opinion piece you wrote in the New York Times. I think it was in the New York Times about your choice, as you just put it. Sometimes you have actually chosen your work over your children. And you did a segment on Good Morning America where it was like, it was such a radical opinion piece that like Good Morning America had to cover it. Here's a woman who's like admitting to this. And I wonder if you just want to say a bit more about, why you thought it was so important. Were you surprised at the response that it got, that it was like so shocking, and why, what you hope both through this novel to be sharing in the story of your character, but also in your real life as a woman who stepped out in the way you did in that piece and on Good Morning America, if you want to, why you think it's so important. Yeah.
So to answer your question, I wrote that piece, and just so everyone's clear, when you write an op-ed for any publication, including the New York Times, you don't get to pick the headline. So the headline that they picked was, "I have picked my job over my kids." And I think that headline alone, some people just read the headline and then, wrote me emails saying that my kids should go into Child Protective Services and I should be arrested. But it also, I never expected this. It prompted all of these women to reach out to me directly and say, essentially, this is my story, because at certain moments, for whatever reason, and oftentimes it was because they were very, very passionate about what they were doing professionally. And there was this need for them to be there. And also this understanding that you don't have to be absolutely present at all times for your kids to be a good mother. And yet that's this thing that when you say it, it will kind of chill a cocktail party conversation, because the assumption is, of course, you would put aside anything so that you could make every PTA meeting and always bring a home-baked treat to, well, they don't allow treats anymore, a home-baked organic salad to a kid's event. And for someone to say, which I did, I have never chaperoned an event. And I've left my kids for significant periods of time, was, I think, the story of a lot of women. That's a silent story. And, my reasons were, and this is what I said in the piece, were that the times that I was gone were because I was involved in these wrongful conviction cases where, my clients were basically relying on me. They were relying on me to get out of prison, and they were innocent. And so if I didn't do the things that I did, they would be stuck in there. And that happened once when my kids were 2 and 4, and it happened again, actually just this past year. And I think I've been able, I hope, over time to explain this to my kids. I actually got to go on the Tamron Hall show too, and she asked me how much therapy I thought they were going to need. And, what I didn't say was everybody needs therapy. What I did say is the jury is out, but I really think that they get it. They understand that these are real people with real problems. And sometimes in certain moments, they need me more. And the other thing is I'm not leaving them on the street begging with, a tin cup, hoping that someone will come and buy them lunch. They have a dad, they have a grandmother, they have this community of people who step up. And I also think that's important because it's this idea that only a mother can provide X, Y, and Z thing. And I just don't think that's true. I don't know. I don't know if that's resonant for you, Anna, or not, but I don't think that's true.
Yeah. Yeah. I have also had to travel a lot for work over the years. And I have kids about your kids' ages, 9 and 11 now. And I think by stepping away, actually, it's created space for other adult figures to step into their lives. I will say the last time I traveled for work was just before the pandemic. I went to India for almost 2 weeks. And when I got home, my younger daughter wrote me this long letter, never leave me for that long again. Please, please. And to this day, she thinks that she jinxed the world. And it was her plea for me not to travel that brought the coronavirus on all of us. I told her it wasn't her fault. But I'm curious then to hear you talk about this shift from doing this work that's so tangibly about this social justice mission you have to taking the time taking the time to work on a novel, on a fiction book. And do you see a through line there? And I don't want to give away too much of the plot line to folks who are tuning in simply to say it's really, absolute page turner. I highly recommend it. But if you want to, in the process of answering this question, give some more hints to what the story is. But I'm just curious about that shift, right? And taking the time to work on a novel in the context of everything else you're working on.
Sure. So the truth is I've always wanted to be a novelist. So I've been trying for, I think, 20 years. And there were 2 other books that preceded this book that just didn't make it into full being. And people say, oh, how did you find the time? It took me years to write this book and to get it published. So it's kind of this dream that I've always had. And I think it's because, and this, nonfiction writing is important and it's interesting. It's also incredibly factually rigorous and you are stuck with your facts to some degree. And of course, you have to be absolutely careful about nailing everything down. And with fiction, you just have all this freedom and you can take ideas and theories and just twist and turn them and pull them in all kinds of different directions. And I really liked that possibility. I like the idea of taking ideas that I had about what does it mean to be a good mother? What does it mean to be guilty or innocent? What does it mean to be a battered woman? Because at the heart of this case is this very young client with an abusive, drunken husband. And the question is, did she kill him in cold blood and premeditate, or was she really fighting for her life and fighting for her child's life? I wanted to take all those ideas and just stretch them as far as I possibly could and make them very extreme in a way that you can't when you're kind of trapped in reality. And then the other thing is that the case itself is based on an actual case that was tried when I was in the federal public defender's office by 2 of my colleagues. And it was riveting. It was absolutely riveting, in part because they were so good at their job, and in part because the facts were pretty similar, where it was just all of the questions that I just said, and they were playing out in real time in federal court. And one of the key moments, and I hope I'm not giving too much away, but the lawyers make a decision about how they decide to put the client on the stand. And then they have her kind of go through this final scene with her husband leading up to the moment that he died. And that my supervisor actually did that.
Oh,
and
really?
Yes. I mean, not to the extreme. Again, fiction's helpful because I got to do some things that, wouldn't be allowed normally, but he went very, very, very far. He pushed the envelope as far as you possibly could. And, there was no one took a breath for that whole direct. And
just to pause there, Lara, for those listening, what Lara's describing is this really dramatic moment in the courtroom, and the why behind it was that, to really help the jury really to see what it would be like to be this young, relative, very small woman, up against a much larger man, her husband, like to physically see that power imbalance is as a reader, what you picked up picturing the scene, because as you wrote it, you could really imagine being in that courtroom. And that part of what the legal strategy was, is that you really have to, in order to convey to people just hearing the story of how that woman might have felt was one thing, but to actually see it physically, that physicality was so important. And so that's fascinating that your colleague actually did that.
It was really, really interesting. And the other similarity, I mean, the judge in my book is just odious. He's just absolutely horrible. He's sadly based on an amalgamation of actual people. The judge in this actual case was extremely difficult, so much so that at one point, one of the attorneys for the client stood up and said, this is outside the presence of the jury. He said, the rulings that you're making and your tone of voice and the way you're treating my client, you're violating her right to a fair trial. And I have to just put that on the record. Like, I'm actually really worried that she's just cannot get a fair trial because of the way that you're acting, which I had never seen anybody do, and left me in complete shock. So it was dramatic in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you say, I mean, as someone who is not a lawyer, has spent some time sitting in courtrooms to observe legal cases, but otherwise I'm very, don't have depth of knowledge of the law. I think in reading it, I learned so much, and you could tell it was written by somebody who actually knows how to practice law. And one of the things that I really felt, and again, you said this judge was particularly odious, but is and for some people, probably no surprise, but for me, it was such a stark reminder of the power that a judge holds. And from your experience in the courtroom, I'm sure that's been something every time you walk into a courtroom is such a clear reality for you.
It's so fascinating, Anna. And I think the other thing is, and I don't want to grossly overgeneralize, but I do feel like there's been this shift. So when I was practicing in federal court in between, I think basically 2001 and 2008, most of the judges were older white men who were all former prosecutors. And a lot of the bad behavior in this book, and that I experienced myself, came from them. And it was partly about power. And it was also because public defenders are considered to be the redheaded stepchildren of the system. And so people just are sort of inclined to not really like them very much. It's sort of like the question, how can you possibly defend this person? And I think that goes through some judges' minds as well. And what's so interesting to me is that I feel like there has been a big change. And now that I'm in court with my students in California state court up here, the bench is extremely diverse. Very little of that kind of thing happens. And then we had this extraordinary experience, my students and I, in Louisiana this past semester, where our client was 19 when he was wrongfully convicted in 2013, and he was sentenced to 60 years with no possibility of parole by an older white former prosecutor judge. And when I went down there for the first hearing, that judge was still on the bench, and he was incredibly dismissive of me and my arguments, my student. And then there was an election, and he lost. He lost to an African-American woman who was a civil rights attorney and a former public defender. And the DA, who was similarly terrible, lost to a civil rights lawyer and an African-American man. So the players completely changed over the course of litigation of this case. And when I came down and went to court the second time, it was the same courtroom, and it was this different judge, and it was a different prosecutor. And the sea change in terms of how I was treated, how my client was treated, and the justice that we got justice. And it's only because of the two of them. It's only because of the two of them. The arguments were the same. The evidence was the same. And it was literally the difference between him getting out and him staying in for the rest of his life. And I attribute that to the fact that we are having a moment now where we are putting people in power who are not going to sit there and abuse it.
Oh my gosh, that story just gave me chills. That's amazing. And it was one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about was this book arriving in this moment where there is what we're witnessing is, I think, this criminal justice reform moment. And particularly, we're seeing these cases of these elections where you're actually seeing what you just described. It's not just happening there; it's happening in places all across the country, but often in these local races that don't get national news, and yet you're seeing that, you're experiencing that change in the courtroom. I wonder if you just want to talk a bit more about this book arriving now into this very different moment of how. Is that mine? Is that yours?
Sorry, that was me. I'm going to turn it off. Keep going. Sorry.
So yeah, just curious, to hear more about what you're seeing from your vantage point, having been, working for so many years as a public defender. What else are you seeing change? Are you seeing that kind of attitude about public defenders? So in your book, these main characters are public defenders. And, I think about most of my friends who've gone into law are public defenders. And I think of them as like these superheroes in my mind. But as you said, historically, they've been cast in a really different light of, the ones who are taking the sides of the murderers and the rapists. And I'm just wondering, I just would love to hear you talk more about this idea of, do you see the characters that you've written into this book, kind of existing in a different world, and where, in addition to those kind of local elections, like where else are you seeing real change happening at that national level or at the local level?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's funny. I was just thinking back to the story. The first case I ever tried by myself, they ended up dismissing, and I went to go see my client to tell him the news, and I was so excited. And he said, "I'm so excited for you. Now you can go get a real job. Someone will hire you." And I wanted to tell him, you have no idea how hard it was to get my job. It's so hard. But of course, the clients think that anything that's free must suck. And I think that's generally been the public perception. But I do think public defenders are having a moment. And I do think, I was joking to my friend, Brendan Woods, who's the head of the Alameda County Public Defender's Office, that public defenders are suddenly sexy, that there is this aura that they're the ones who are taking on the fight on the ground in the courtroom for racial justice. And really it's about their efforts and they're moving the ball forward. And so this book is really my love letter to public defenders because they are some of the best lawyers around and they don't get credit for it. And it's especially my love letter to women public defenders, because even now as public defenders are having a moment, the most prominent ones are men in the media. And actually they're some of the just most amazing creative advocacy is coming from women. And many of them are my friends and I see them in action. And I just wanted to kind of distill them down into this particular person. And it's also my love letter to hardworking moms who make all kinds of choices, because this protagonist, she makes some pretty controversial choices and she pays a really heavy price. And I think that's also true for a lot of women, regardless of their profession.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, so people feel free, those tuning in live, feel free to put comments or questions into the chat. So I have more questions for you, but I also want to come to a question that came in, which is, were you influenced by legal fiction writers such as John Grisham or Thoreau or someone else? I mean, yeah, just again, curious where the craft inspiration and craft knowledge, obviously, you know how to try a case in court, but writing a novel is its own craft. And so, curious if you want to share any bit about your influences or your learning of the craft.
So someone once asked me, who's the best editor you've ever had? And the truth is that the best editor I've ever had is my older sister, Emily, who's a journalist and also a lawyer. So I wrote something in 2013 that my sister helped me edit. And it was the first thing I'd ever written for a lay audience about the law. And I thought it was the best thing ever. I just thought, this doesn't need editing. It's perfect. And my sister, she tried to be nice, but she was basically like, 80% of this needs to go. It's really boring. And what you think is interesting because you're a lawyer isn't that interesting to people who aren't lawyers. And also you just have to explain it in this really straightforward way. And that was just a turning point for me in the way that I kind of thought about writing, and her edits and her suggestions from that point forward really guided me. Then with respect to the fiction, the answer to that question is yes. I think Scott Turow in particular did have a huge influence over me. He's one of those people that he's a very well-read and extremely popular best-selling author. He's also a great writer and he's a lawyer. And I think to be able to write about a legal case in a way that people will want to read and make accessible, you just have to dial back the legalese and you have to really, break it down into its most fundamental and exciting parts. And so for me, what that meant was I cut a lot. Every time I said to myself, is this advancing the plot? And the answer was no, I cut it. And every time I thought, is this confusing to someone who's not a lawyer? I cut it. And so I think people like that who are lawyers, who are successful at telling stories, legal stories, are a huge influence. And so too is just having people in the real world who've read my other writing about the law tell me, this is working, but this isn't. And basically the criticism almost always is like, you're much more interested in this than anybody else.
I feel like I'm a great test subject for your book, Lara. As I said before, like, I really don't know much about the law, and I feel like I felt never confused. So I feel like I was a good test reader for it. And I feel like, and I feel like the other thing you gather as a reader, though, is that you feel like you trust. Like, obviously I already knew you too, so I could trust you, but I feel like as a reader, you trust that there is like a person behind the story who actually isn't just making up, isn't just like pulling it out of a hat. Like you really feel that it's grounded in how the law works and how cases unfold. The other thing I feel like you get from reading your book is a reminder that lawyers are storytellers.
Yes, that is.
I mean, isn't so much of your work with your clients about learning their story and then telling their story as a way to defend them?
Yes, that's a great point. And I think it's especially true when you're talking to a jury, but also when you're talking to a judge. You're much better off with the personal narrative and the specific facts than you are starting out, for example, with this is the law and this is how I'm going to prove it to you. And, you need to pay attention to this element or that element. I think it's much more compelling if you can say, this is who this person is, particularly because the jurors, even though they're instructed that the person is presumed innocent, human beings are human beings. And if you're in the jury box and you're looking at the person who's sitting there, you're wondering what they did. You're not thinking, what's this wrongly accused person doing here? And so even though there's this presumption of innocence, actually your client is at a huge disadvantage. And oftentimes your client is a person of color and someone who doesn't have any money. At least those would be my clients. And so there's another disadvantage. And I wanted specifically for this client to be a woman of color because I thought it was important to be realistic about who ends up getting tangled up in the system. The vast majority of my clients who are women and men are not white. And that's, I think, the experience of many, many people who are public defenders. So to answer that question, yeah, I thought that it was really important to showcase storytelling, which is, I think, what both of these defenders of this particular client try to do. And it was actually really interesting when my students and I went to New Orleans in March for the hearing on whether or not our client was going to be exonerated. I talked to him beforehand and he said, my real story was never told. No one told that story because his lawyers were so ineffective. They didn't present a defense at all. And in fact, he had an alibi. And it was a much bigger story than that. It was really a story about systemic racism in the most concrete way that you can imagine, in that his trial happened in 2013, but it really might as well have happened in 1813 because of the fact that you didn't need a unanimous jury, which is a Jim Crow relic, because of who was sitting on the jury, because of who the judge was, because of his experience after he was convicted, which is that he spent years in a prison that's actually really a plantation where you have to pick crops. And so none of that had ever been told. Instead, the jury had heard basically a case that took about 90 minutes to try from start to finish. That was
a 19-year-old. It was going to be put away for 60 years without possibility for parole, had 90 minutes.
It was a 90-minute trial, and the crime itself was a gunpoint robbery that lasted less than 2 minutes, and no one was injured. And $100 was taken, $103. And that for that crime, he got 60 years without the possibility of parole. And there was just no one cared about who he was, and no one cared about telling a story, just absolutely no one. And it was just one of the most excruciating things about this case was that the state had taped all of his calls illegally. They had taped all of his calls with his lawyers. And in the calls from the beginning, he's saying, get the hotel footage. It will clear me. It will show me at this hotel. Get my cell phone. The records will clear me. They'll show that I was 8 miles away. Get the woman I was with. She will clear me. You need her to come in and sign an affidavit. This is her name. This is her phone number. And they just didn't do anything. And so it's agonizing as his lawyer to listen to that. And so anyways, when I finally did get to court, I thought, this is your day, Utico. Like, this is your day. And so I'm going to tell your story from start to finish. using as many of your words as I possibly can, using the documents, using the letter that he wrote to his pen pal that said, "Dear Miss Karen, you asked why I'm here. This is why," using quotes from his calls, and just using as many of his words as I possibly could, because I really wanted there to be a public record of what his real story was. And so I did that in part for him, and in part also because I knew that I was in a courtroom where the judge was actually going to listen to what I had to say and respond to it, which she did. And I knew I was in a courtroom where the district attorney was going to respond and apologize, which they did. And wow. It was very emotional. And the other thing is, and I guess I'm going to stop talking about this case in a second because I realize I'm like going on too long about it. But the other thing about it is that I think women litigators, it's very hard for us to get angry because anger does not look good on women. That's what we're told. It's a really bad look for you. Don't raise your voice. Don't get upset. And I was told that the whole time I was a federal public defender, like that you're being too loud, don't raise your voice, et cetera. And with this case, I just felt like if ever there was a time to raise your voice and get upset, it's now.
Right.
It's now. And I thought, I'm 47 years old. I've had enough. I'm mad. And on behalf of my client, and I have every right to be mad. And I also felt like, my law students should see this because they are the next generation. And they were all women, as it turned out. And I thought, good. So let them see a lawyer get mad who's a woman and prevail. And hopefully they'll take that as a sign that times are changing. I hope.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's anger, right? That's like that's a justified anger. It's anger, as you put it, on behalf of your client, right? It's like that there is an injustice that's been served here, and that you have every right, as you said, to be angry. And as you said, like in the context of a courtroom, that literally was a different courtroom because of the people who populated it than it was when the case started. So, I mean, that's an incredible. I can't even imagine. I mean, what was it like for I can only imagine what it was like for your students.
It was incredibly emotional. It was very, very emotional. There was some last minute drama that I don't really want to get into, but we weren't sure the hearing was going to happen. We had to change our plane tickets a bunch of times. We flew down there. We still didn't know if we were actually going to go forward that morning. So there was just like a lot of nerves. Plus my students had developed a very strong bond with him, and actually so had my kids. And that's because of the pandemic and Zoom. So what happened was that the prison just converted all the visits to Zoom. And of course, I was stuck in my house. So my kids would be wandering in and out. They got to know him because he was on Zoom all the time. And my students got to know him. I mean, by the end of that year, we had spent hours and hours and hours with each other. And so we had this, they felt, deeply, deeply invested in the case, not just legally, but because they really had a very strong bond with him, as did my kids. I mean, the morning of the hearing, my daughter texted me to say, "Mommy, are you nervous?" And I said, "I am nervous AF." And she said, "I love you. I'm here supporting you. I know it's going to go great." And it was just like so nice that my kids watched. They watched the hearing on Zoom. Yeah. And I was, that was like really meaningful to me that they were watching and connected. So yes, it was incredibly, incredibly emotional. And just, I wished that he had physically been there because of the pandemic. He was also on Zoom. So that was
he was watching this all unfold on Zoom.
I know.
The fate of his future on Zoom.
I know.
Wow.
Yeah. That part was crazy.
Wow. Well, and I mean, this story, Lara, this is the story that we began the conversation with about what's it like to mother. We didn't even talk about mothering in the pandemic, but to be a mother and to be a working mother, and for your kids to see there is this person whose life you are literally trying to save to get him exonerated, for them to see that that's where your energy is going. And that's why you need to be on Zoom and not playing with them. It's pretty powerful for them to see that.
I hope so. I mean, we definitely had our moments where they felt like I was a little bit overly invested, but I think in the end they understand. And actually, I know this is going to sound like a sappy Hallmark movie, but my client Utico is turning 28 on the 11th of June, and my kids and I are going, and my parents are going, and my sister is going. So we're all going to go have a big party and celebrate in New Orleans. My kids have never met him. So I'm really excited. I'm really excited for that because I think it's going to be fun. And we're going to invite all the people who helped with the case. So it's going to just be a big reunion. he had cancer. So his doctor who took care of him is going to be there. I mean, it's just going to be this kind of, I know I'm getting choked up even thinking about it. I think it's going to be just a wonderful, and the juror who voted to acquit him is going to be there. I mean, it's going to be like intense. The judge is going to be there. So yeah, I'm excited for this get together.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing that story. And, it ties into another theme we wanted to talk about, which is, the connection between this novel and your previous book about another person who was wrongfully convicted, who you helped to exonerate. And I wonder if you want to just take a few minutes about tying that book into this novel and kind of how it links to both the work of exoneration, but also, as you write about in the book, and someone put in the chat a piece in the Sun magazine that around your work around restorative justice. If you want to put that conversation together, I feel like there has been a big, certainly some public conversation about exoneration and work like the Innocence Project. But I think what your work layers onto that is this piece around the restorative justice work that I wonder if you want to just say a few words on.
Sure. I think it is important to talk about that. And whoever mentioned this, Sarah, thank you for mentioning that interview on the Sun. So it was interesting. So this other case that I had in 2013, which was the last time I was away from my kids for a significant period of time, the client had been, that case was in some ways even darker because he had been convicted at 18 and sentenced. It was a death case. The jury hung on death and he got life without the possibility of parole. And he had been incarcerated for 34 years for a murder that he didn't commit. And one of the things that was really, and it was a very different situation in that we got nothing but resistance from the LA district attorney at the time. And so they just fought us tooth and nail. We had to retry the case. And that's why I was gone for a long time, because the retrial took a long time. And one of the things that happened during the retrial that was upsetting in a way that I had not expected. I mean, there were a million things about it that were incredibly emotional, including that my client's mom, who was almost 80 at that point and had just been like praying every day for his release, believed that the Innocence Project was divine intervention. So it felt like a lot of pressure, because that's a lot of pressure. And also it was just a big fight it wasn't like Utico's case. It was just every day in there was just an absolute dogfight. But one thing that really took me aback was that the government, I think in a way to signal to the judge, had brought the victim's family in and had them sit behind the DA. And this man had been murdered, and they had his daughter come and then the relatives and friends. And I, as a public defender, I had been trained to you do not think about the victim. You do not think about the victim unless you, God forbid, have to cross-examine them, but mostly just like don't even look over there. And I really did look at the victim because the case unraveled every day. And I think what was happening was that from the daughter's perspective, this story that she had been told for her entire life was just being exposed as a lie. And then in fact, they were using her as a prop essentially. And sitting there, she was realizing just the monumental injustice that was done because the two witnesses had both perjured themselves. There was actually a Perry Mason moment with one of those witnesses. And so it really made me think about, oh my God, what is it like for the victims? What is it like for the victims? Because what's the aftermath for them?
Sorry to interrupt you, but that is such a key point, Lara, that you have, when you have a wrongful conviction, you have the victim of the person who was wrongfully convicted, but you also have the victim of, the family of maybe the victim whose crime is not solved, who's left without the real story of what happened, right? And those are, of course, very different experiences, but both of those are a failure of the justice system to work. Right.
Yes, exactly. That's right. And it's so horrible and painful for them because basically they're just being traumatized all over again. And of course, there was no real perpetrator to be found because the district attorney had the position that my guy was the perpetrator, like all the way up until the bitter end. So it's horrible for them. And it made me think about what's the healing path for all of these people? Because the other thing is that I think we have this idea that people get out and they get millions of dollars and they go on a cruise and they find their significant other and they sail away and it's just beautiful. And that's really not true for most exonerees. They really, really struggle. My students and I are working with Utico now. Like you have to get a job. You have to find a place to live. You have to totally reorient yourself out of being an institutionalized, incarcerated person and exist in the real world and live the rest of your life. And most people don't get any money. or any kind of assistance or help. And so there's just massive victimization on all sides, and also just a lot of anger. I mean, I know I personally felt a lot of anger, even though I wasn't the victim or the wrongfully incarcerated person. Just even being up that close to it was incredibly harming and psychologically traumatic, just as the advocate. And so it really made me think, like, is there a way to bring people together? Is there a way to work through trauma? And that's when I learned about this concept of restorative justice. And that's what my first book was about. And it was looking at this possibility of bringing together the victims' families and wrongfully incarcerated people to kind of go through a process of talking through what happened and talking through the mutual harm and the different harms and seeing the case from the other person's point of view as a way of healing, because generally restorative justice is actually used in a more kind of clear-cut binary case where there's clearly someone who committed a harm and clearly someone who was harmed. And that's a process that's now being used more and more. But I wanted to think about it in terms of a kind of situation where almost like everybody was a victim.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because in many of the cases, as we said, there's impacts on both sides. Yeah. I wonder, we have just a few more minutes left, and please put any questions from those tuning in, and I will share them with Lara. So questions, type them into the chat. Anything's up for grabs. As you can see, we're talking novels, we're talking criminal justice, we're talking public defenders. And I just want to share, Lara, something that came in from someone who's tuning in, who wrote, as someone who's married to someone who was wrongfully convicted, I couldn't agree more. It's not that rosy picture that everyone might imagine. Settling back into life and working through the trauma and the ripple effects of it is a lifelong struggle. Thank you for sharing that. And I wonder if you want to talk some more, Lara, about what you're seeing as, are you seeing hope in terms of some of the broader systemic changes to go upstream, to stop people from being wrongfully convicted, so that you don't have people like the person who our viewer is married to, who was wrongfully convicted and now has this lifelong trauma that they are on a daily basis working through. So I wonder, from your vantage point, what you want to share in response to that comment and some of the systems change you're seeing.
I do think so. The woman who asked,
it's Raha Lewis, and Lara's with her husband's case.
And her husband, Jerome Dixon, what happened to him, I really, truly hope in my heart would not happen today. But basically, when he was a kid, he was railroaded, interrogated for over 30 hours, and they just forced a confession out of him. And then another series of horrible events happened where basically they told him, if you just do some years in juvie, you'll be fine. But actually it was a trick. And he ended up serving a ton of time in an adult prison, all because of the false confession. And what was really interesting about Jerome's case is that when he was up for parole, because that's why he's out, the parole board believed him. They actually, and convincing a parole board that you're innocent, I mean, that is a Sisyphusian task. So that just goes to show you how egregious it was. So those kinds of abuses, I feel like, were very, very common in the 80s and the 90s, and even in the early 2000s. And of course, my client was tried in 2013, and they were using outrageous cross-racial identification procedures that would be banned now. So it's not perfect now, but the more we elect people like the new DA in New Orleans, the more we elect people like the new DA in LA, the more that we elect people like the new DA in San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, St. Louis, the more you're going to see people in those positions who are going to say, I'm not going to interrogate a kid for 95 hours until I get a confession out of him. I'm not going to use a procedure that I know is almost guaranteed to identify the wrong person. I'm going to stop doing these things because they're wrong. And if the police keep doing them, I'm not going to prosecute those cases. And so it does give me hope. And people say, well, there's not that many progressive prosecutors, Lara. And I'm like, well, yes and no, because they have jurisdiction over millions and millions of people. If you have a progressive DA in Philadelphia, which you do, in San Francisco, in LA, in Chicago, in St. Louis, in Boston, that's millions and millions and millions of people. So it's not bad. And it's not a bad start. And the fact that the DA in Philadelphia, and actually one of my sisters works for him, was just reelected, was, I think, a real shot in the arm for this movement.
Right. And reelected like really resoundingly, right?
Yes. Wasn't even close.
Right. And I think everything you're saying, Lara, it's so helpful for folks to hear or be reminded of the power of those local elections, right? Like, you might feel that might not seem directly related to your life, might not totally understand these ripple effects, but to see that how much these local elections are part of moving toward a system that's more aligned with justice than one that we've ever had.
Yes, I think that's really important to know because I feel like, for example, during the Trump administration, and I don't mean to presume the politics of everybody, but there was certainly a lot of concern and consternation around the attorney general, both when it was Jeff Sessions and then later when it was Bill Barr, and the idea that they were not doing justice in that office, and just a lot of concern about covering up corruption, a lot of concern about not enforcing civil rights. All of that is perfectly valid in my opinion, but it's also important to understand that even though those people grab the headlines, the top federal prosecutors prosecute very, very, very few people. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of people who are churned through the system, over 90%, are prosecuted at a state level by the local DAs. And so a lot of people don't focus on those elections because they're down ballot and who cares, but it actually matters tremendously who your DA is. It's hugely important in terms of how justice is meted out. And in an immediate way that impacts your life, it's much, 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 much more important than honestly who the federal attorney general is.
Yeah, really good point. So I want to bring in another question you got here in the chat, Lara, as we close up our time together. We have time for a few more questions. So if you have more, please put them into your chat. So the question that came in is, Lara, you make such an important point about the trauma inflicted on those who are regularly exposed to the abuses perpetrated by our dysfunctional justice system. Besides working toward restorative justice, how do you care for yourself on a daily basis in the face of the toxic psychological assaults connected with your work?
I wish I had a good answer to this question. So it's funny. So with this case in New Orleans, I partnered with my sister, which is a long story that will become clear, I think, in July when something will appear about it in writing. But we went down there together and, well, we were on different planes because we live in different parts of the country. And I just kept saying, I am so nervous. I'm freaking out. And she said, well, why don't you try meditating? And I said, I don't meditate. And she's like, why don't you? She kept suggesting all of these things for me to do. And finally I said, I don't have any hobbies. Okay. I really don't. And I keep thinking I'm going to find a hobby I'm going to knit. I'm going to crochet a blanket. I'm going to do something that's much more grounded in self-care. I have to figure that part of my life out because I feel like I don't actually spend enough time doing that. And then as a result, I'm just way too, either nervous or angry. And it would be great for me to develop a hobby. So that's a goal that I have for this year.
I love that. I don't feel like I've had a hobby since I had kids. So
that too. That's right. And I know that Susan, I don't know how much time we have, but I know that Susan wanted me to talk about the Register Fellowship.
Oh, yeah, please do if you want. Yeah.
Sure. So again, listeners and people who might want to come to Mesa or might want to support Mesa, so the Register Fellowship is named after my client in LA, the 2013 case. And believe it or not, I swear to God, his name is Cash Register. That's his last name, Register, and his mom named him Cash. So I named the fellowship after him. It's the Register Fellowship. And I try to fund it every year to have somebody come to the Mesa to work on restorative justice, to work on some kind of restorative justice work. And we've had some unbelievable fellows, including, and we've had some unbelievable people come and write about restorative justice, including Sujatha Baliga, who got the MacArthur Genius Grant last year. So that was really, really thrilling. She's an amazing alum. And anyway, I say this because number one, if you write about restorative justice, this fellowship might be for you. And two, if you're interested and you have like $5 or $10 and you want to contribute to the Mesa, to that fellowship, that would be great.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it was really, I remember being at the Mesa Refuge and we used to be able to be together in person at a beautiful event they had on the property, and you were sharing the launch of that fellowship. And it felt very much the spirit of like paying it forward that you're part of, really trying to, pay it forward. All right, we have time for a couple more questions, maybe. If you have any questions, any other questions, folks listening, please put them in the chat. I'm curious, Lara, just actually not to even really ask you a directed question, more to give you some space. If there was something you wanted to share with us about what this process was like of working on this book, or even the process now of having the book out in the world. I know it's been getting a lot of attention. I think it was picked up by the New York Times as one of the top top thrillers of the year for folks to read for their summer reading. But if you want to, what else? What did you want to share with us that I didn't prompt you to share that you'd like to share?
Well, I guess maybe a couple of things. One is that I feel like the writing process is so hard and it's very, very discouraging. And I think that people think, oh, you must have just kind of whipped this off in your spare time, and then you sent it to your agent, and then you got a huge amount of money, and then this amazing thing happened, and it was just that easy. And it's not that easy at all. And it's the same thing. I'm sure, Anna, although perhaps you've had better luck than me with nonfiction writing. And the truth is that for everything that I've ever gotten published, there's 5 things that have gotten rejected. And I know I'm making progress now because I actually get rejected rather than ignored. So they'll actually say no instead of just nothing. It's a hard vocation. It's a hard thing to do, and you do it out of love and you do it out of passion. And I guess what I would say to people who are in that space, and which I wish maybe someone had said to me in my darkest times, and maybe I'm in for more of them in the future with the more rejections, is to keep going and to really believe in your own writing and in the possibility of it working out in the end, because it can be a really hard road. And I did not get a huge advance, and I do not expect to make a ton of money, et cetera. I mean, it's a blessing, and it's kind of almost a miracle that it even happened. And also, I know that like the next book is going to be kind of a similar struggle. And the next thing I try to pitch to get published may very well, odds are, get rejected. And that's part of being a writer. That's part of existing as a writer in the world. And so I guess I feel like it's important to normalize that because it doesn't appear that way. And I think a lot of people want to present an image of themselves as a successful fill in the blank. And so a successful writer has a perfect Instagram page and pictures with famous people and pictures of a latte and a notebook. And it makes it look very glamorous and it makes it look very easy. And actually, of course, writing is absolutely excruciating. And so is getting rejected. And so I guess all of that to say, you should just keep going. And and part of why I dedicated the book to my dad is because, my dad would always encourage me. And at one point, this was when I was much younger, he said something like, people like us, we have to try harder to get what we want. But if we try hard enough, ultimately we'll succeed. And I've always really taken that to heart. Every wait list I ever got off, or every time I barely got in the door, or every time someone told me that my case was a loser or whatever, I would come back to that and think, sometimes you have to go a lot of rounds. You've got to go 10 rounds or 15 rounds. And being a public defender is a good setup for being a writer because we're used to that. We're used to just like withstanding loss after loss after loss and getting up off the mat. And I guess that's really the message. I feel like whatever your chosen passion or vocation is, but particularly if it's writing, you just have to get off the mat.
I love that. Get off the mat. And I think I'm so glad you said that too, Lara, particularly for a book like this that I mentioned at the top of our time together, that it is a real page turner. And it really, I think I've read this book faster than any book I've read. I can't even in years. And so as a reader, it feels easy. Right. As a reader, you're just pulled into the story. And as a reader, I was like, oh my gosh, Lara must have just this all must have just come to her. It feels, this is the thing, right? About a good book, especially a good novel, it's like you're as a reader, you're on the surfboard surfing, and it's just the perfect wave, and you just catch the wave and you just cruise to the beach. It feels like the easiest thing. So to have you remind us that, of course, for the writer, for the process, it's not easy, and that the persistence that it took for you to get to this point is really huge. So thank you for that. I definitely feel inspired because again, no matter what we are each doing, whether we're writers or lawyers or anything, that kind of persistence and keeping at it is so critical. So thank you for that, Lara.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you so much for everyone for joining us today, and Lara for sharing incredible stories, sharing your incredible work. I'm going to just give a few shout outs here, Lara, and please jump in if I miss anything. So we can all keep supporting Lara in this incredible book by sharing news about the book with friends. Again, it's called The Good Mother. I don't even know if I said the book's title. So it's called The Good Mother. You can learn more at Lara's website, larabazelon.com. Again, we want to thank you all for joining us at this program called From the Gathering Room. It's an ongoing series. You can go to mesarefuge.org to find out more about them. And you can not just find out about ones that will happen in the future, but you can also look back at our archives and tune into conversations like this that we've had with Mesa alum, again, at mesarefuge.org. And I mentioned that Lara's book was profiled. It was in the New York Times recommendations for new thrillers. You can see her profile there. And then we put it into the chat too, but I highly recommend, if you want more stories from Lara, I highly recommend the conversation she had with Piper Kerman, who wrote Orange is the New Black, that became the hit television series that I think just ended after 8 seasons, something like that. But they had a conversation together, and it's hosted at the Commonwealth Club. So highly recommend it. And feels like perfect timing because my child has just arrived. So I'm going from this to go be a mother for a bit. Feels perfect timing. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. And Lara, thank you for your generosity of spirit, generosity of time, and for the incredible work that you do in the world.
I feel the same exact way about you. All my love to you. Thank you for doing this with me. It was wonderful to be with you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.